Hi everyone, I'm Neil Podbery and today I'm going to go through a few weathering techniques with you that I use in my day-to-day work. Today we're going to be looking at weathering this Dapol ready-to-run van. But before I go ahead with any weathering, I'll just go through a few of the products that I use when undertaking a weathering job. So on to the products that I use. Predominantly I use artist oil paints. I also use enamels, but I find that the artist oil paints give me blendability for longer, and I just think that the colours are fantastic for undertaking the weathering techniques that I do. My preferred colours, or the ones that I use most of, are titanium white, ivory black and raw umber, but I also use brown ochre and Indian red. Brown ochre and Indian red I tend to use obviously for more rust effects and things like that, and in fact I will sometimes apply them and then add weathering powders into them to create that slightly grainy finish that rust can often have. Another set of paints that I've also started to use are the Omen miniature range. What I like about these is they really do finish, they provide a real ultra matte finish, which is excellent, particularly on wagon underframes, locomotive underframes, chassis, etc. They're also very, very good coverers. They cover stuff really, really well. I tend to use them though after I've used an airbrush on top of what I've airbrushed, because again you can add some nice effects into them if you include weathering powders and such in with them, and they just leave a lovely matte finish, which is really important obviously with some of the looks and techniques that I'm trying to employ. Moving on to weathering powders, there are lots and lots on the market, but I've just started to use these Vallejo pigments, which I really like. I think they're excellent. They come in some really good natural colours. Also, I use the MIG range of colours and some of the Humbrol colours as well. Of course, all of these tend to be various dirty shades or rusty shades, and they can be blended together. Plus, they can also be used with thinners or water, depending on your preference. On to airbrushing. I have to say, I don't actually use an airbrush for huge amounts of the work that I undertake, but it is an invaluable tool to create misting effects and to cover things like chassis and roofs in an initial coat ready for the next coats that come afterwards. I've already produced or made a pre-mix that's going to be used on our ready-to-run wagon, but the colours that I've used in order to do that are matte 160, matte 33 and matte 119. I'm just about to start spraying the underframe of the vehicle, but before I do I should just mention that I've actually blackened the wheel rims as they come in a shiny metal with a black marker pen. You could also do it with a brown marker pen if you want to. I sometimes chop and change, but in truth it makes very little difference. Right. I hope that you'll be able to see this okay. I'm just going to give the chassis underframe a gentle waft over with the airbrush. Actually, before I do, I'll just test that it's all going okay. Yeah, it's firing okay. And here we go. Now I've sprayed the chassis, I'm going to move on to doing a couple of panels on the side of the van to show you the technique that I use when making it look weathered. Right. I'm going to mix some of the brown, the black and the white. And the white is a real help with just giving the van or piece of rolling stock or what have you a slightly faded appearance. This looks quite crude, what I'm about to do, but a lot of what I do is about what you remove rather than what you leave in place. So here goes. Back paint, work it into all the recesses, into all the nooks and crannies, and hopefully it should leave it all in those areas when we come to the next stage. It does look incredibly crude, I appreciate, but hopefully it's worth it in the end. Right, just work it into the edge. We'll stop here, I won't go any further than this point here. It's best to work in small sections at a time, I find. Although I would say that being oil paint is great because you get to work it up and for a long time after you've applied it, which is another one of the great facets of using oil paint. Right, I don't know if you can see that. Again, pretty horribly crude. Right, I'm now going to just rinse the brush in thinners and start to just work some of the paint down and out, working in downward streaks as happens in nature with the way that the water and muck and everything run. Again, this all looks pretty crude at this stage, but hopefully the next few stages should sort of show how it hopefully starts to bring it to life. Okay, right, that's that pretty much. Right, paper towel. Initially, I'm just going to run that out. So I'd also say that none of the techniques I employ are particularly new or innovative. Most of them have been taken from books, the internet, watching various things on YouTube regarding weathering and weathering techniques. The military modelers are absolutely superb at it, and I've taken a lot of inspiration from the work that they've done. I should probably mention that here I have a dry brush, completely dry brush, that I'm now going to start just gently working into these areas again. It's important to have a few dry brushes to hand because it enables you to blend and move the oil paint around on the surface. As you can see, we're getting somewhere now to a kind of a filthy looking mess, but again, there's a lot of refining yet to do. I'm not sure which I will be able to show you every part of, but I will do my best to. Right, onto another dry brush, bigger brush, flat brush. I'm just going to work this up and down, always going in a vertical fashion to try and just work it. Hopefully you can see that the streaks are starting to fade. I'll bring the camera a bit closer in a minute. Work them down, 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 down. Try and get them to sit in all the areas that it would naturally accumulate, the dirt would naturally accumulate in. I think that's getting somewhere near. Might just do one more thing with yet another dry brush and just work in. If you see this motion, you can just see, I hope, that it's just starting to show the original body panel colour through as I work and remove most of the paint that I've applied. Let's just work that into there. Right, I don't know if you can see that any better, but the first stage of weathering the body side. I'm just going to show you a little bit of refined technique, I suppose you might call it now, with things like dirt around the rivets and stuff like that. I'll still be using the oil paints because, as I say, the great beauty is that they can be blended so beautifully. So using some of the same mix that I used before on the panel sides, I'm just going to take a little bit up on a small brush and just gently dab it around the rivets as carefully as I can. You don't have, when I say carefully, you don't have to be too careful, but it's just good to, you know, you don't want to daub it everywhere if you're just trying to get a little bit of refined look of where the dirt accumulates around them. as you can see hopefully in the picture how that's building up. And what I tend to do after I've done this is I reblend, and so that's the great beauty of oil. You can reblend them almost to your heart's content for at least a few hours anyway. Right, so I just grab the blender brush now, which doesn't matter really what it is. I tend to use something like this. I just gently work over those. Actually, it removes some of the paint, which is what you want. Better to over apply first and then remove, I find. But hopefully that gives you some idea of the dirt accumulated around the rivets. I'm just going to do the side panels of the van over with some of the weathering powder. I've mixed up some of the dark yellow ochre and the natural iron oxide from the Vallejo range. I'm just going to apply that along the bottom edge of the van side just to suggest the road dirt that accumulates over times of these wagons being in service. So here goes. As you see, I'm applying quite a lot of it, but once more, as with the paint, I'm going to actually remove lots of it. Depending obviously on the age of the van, you can be heavier with this or lighter, that's totally up to you. So now I've applied it, some of that will inevitably stick in the oil paint that is unbelievably or fantastically still wet. But I'm going to use this flat brush, and I'm just going to gently work off some of the weathering powders so that we get some of the polycolour coming back through. Well, as you know, I've oversprayed the chassis with a light coat from the airbrush, but like I said, I don't use the airbrush that extensively, but it's a good basis for the next techniques that I'm going to use. I'm now going to use the Omen miniatures paints just to add a bit of variation, colour and an element of texture to the chassis underframe. And I'll start at the end that we've already begun weathering. I'm going to be using the colours Underframe Dirt, Oily Black and Dirty Black and applying them to some of the underframe of the wagon just to give a bit of variation in texture and colour from the original light spray coat from the airbrush. I'm going to start with the underframe dirt, brown, and I'll just apply it relatively randomly over things, but significantly where I know from looking at references, etc., rust or dirt tends to accumulate, like around axle boxes and so forth, and around the rivets and such on the underframe. As I said before, these act as a fantastic matte colour and texture for the application of weathering powders and further techniques with oil paints over the top if you should so wish. Right, I should just move on to the dirty black because that will give us a little indication of deposited oil around the axle boxes and around areas that would have seen or accumulated oil on the real thing. Right, I think I'll leave that there for now. So I've added some of the ultra matte Omen miniature paints, as you know, over the chassis and in different areas, and I'll just finish off by showing you what I do with the weathering powders. In this instance, I will probably use them dry, because the paints have done a good job of creating a nice effect over the area that I'm working on. So I'll just go ahead and mix some ochre and some burnt umber from the Vallejo range. It's very good how these mix up, and I shall just again over apply on the chassis, etc., and just work that in. You can see how it looks a bit of a mess, but it's just picking up it's a bit ochre, but that's fine. And I'll just blow that away like that, and then work over it with a flat brush, just so that it just sort of stays in the recess. I'm being quite brutal with the brush in this instance, but it just means it stays hopefully where you want it to stay. And then just add a little more from the Humble Earth Brown over the spring. As you can hopefully see, that's just turning out a nice brown colour, and again into the rivets underneath. There we go, and back to the blending brush, or the big flat brush as I call it, just to work off leaving the previous layers of paint, etc., coming through. One nice little touch that I do sometimes do, again this is on the axle box, and this is where prototype reference is so important, is just to get some of the oil paint, the black, ivory black oil paint, and dry brush over the axle box. As you can see, it just suggests where the oil has and adds to the effect that we created with the flat paint before. Just adds a little something to suggest the spill of oil, or the oil lubrication around the axle box. I hope that you can make that out. I'm going to move on to the roof now, which, as you can see, I've removed from the wagon. Obviously the example here is absolutely pristine, and we need a more careworn appearance. For that, again, I'm going to go back to the Omen paints, and in fact worn tarmac, which I think is an excellent faded sort of colour for roof, or for roof weathering I should say. So I'll work this over the roof using my brush. I'm going to just add a drop of water to it. I need it to be quite a thin mix. Actually, that's probably a bit too thin to us, but it's got a nice warmth to it, this colour, which I think comes over really well. In fact, actually, it's probably a bit thin, so I'll just gently, some tissue, dump that away. That is the slight downside of being used to oil paints. I tend to forget how quickly the water-based paints dry, and they don't give you much chance to work them, so you do have to work much more quickly. But I've definitely made that too wet, so it's just thicken that slightly. As you can see, when I use the swab there, or the piece of kitchen towel, I actually deliberately stippled the effect in order, even though I was wiping it off, in order to give the roof that kind of look of canvas by creating that kind of stipple effect. Obviously I've just obliterated it now using the thicker paint, but hopefully you'll see once I'll just get up to about there, and then I'm going to use a big round brush here, and I'm just going to stipple that and work that paint to create a little bit of texture where I can. And I don't know if this is, I'm sorry I'm in the light there, and hopefully you'll be able to see once I move that, hopefully you'll be able to see there's an element of texture to it. That's the starting point really, and what's nice about that, when that dries, it will catch weathering powders if indeed you want to add any more to it, or you can add other layers over the top of it but not do it as comprehensively, which gives you patchiness, which is also quite a nice effect. One thing I meant to mention was the need or the necessity for weathering from really good photo references. As you can see here, these are black and white images, but they do give you a really good idea of the way that the wagon ages, some of the markings, the chalking, things like that, all that can be added to your model. But the best way, as I say, of adding them is using actual references, and I can't stipulate how strongly I feel about that being the case when you're weathering something. I've given you a brief insight into the techniques that I've used to weather rolling stock, and in this case, the Dapol BR van. I thought it would be a good idea though to complete one of the sides, or near complete one of the sides, so that you had an idea of what the finished vehicle actually looks like. There are some obvious omissions at this stage that I will probably add, things like chalking, maybe a wagon poster, I'm not sure yet, and there's probably a few more little bits and pieces that I'd like to undertake to it before I could say it's complete, but I hope it gives you some idea of the finished article. I hope you've enjoyed the video and have found some of what I've gone through with regard to weathering interesting or possibly even useful. Thanks very much for watching.